Yes.
All right. Hi, everyone. This is Scott King over at Zimperium, and I'm joined here with Phil Hotchmuth and John Michelson. They're going to present some how to calculate the risk of your mobile endpoints, and by that we mean your mobile devices. So this is going to be about a 45-minute presentation. We will have time, obviously, for questions and answer. We'd love to get some questions from the audience, and we'll provide some answers and some insight at the end of the webinar. So this webinar is being recorded, and we've got some links on the side. If you look in your GoToWebinar window, we do have a report that Phil has authored from IDC. So please take a look at that and download that. So I'll hand it over to Phil. His research provides insights into how enterprises deploy mobile devices and applications in management and security platforms. He does all types of research on EMM, enterprise mobility, mobile data threat protection, and security technologies. So he's going to kick us off today and talk about some of his research, and then we're going to hand it over to John Michelson, Chief Product Officer at Zimperium. So take it away, Phil.
All right, thanks, Scott. Yeah, and as I said, my name is Phil Hotchmuth. I'm the Program Director for Enterprise Mobility Research at IDC. And today we'll be talking about, in my section, securing mobile devices in the enterprise. And I'll be going over some of our IDC research, particularly on how enterprises are deploying mobile mobility, some of the security threats and challenges they're seeing as they become more mobile from a workforce and operations standpoint. Just a quick overview of the agenda. We'll first talk about kind of where we've come from and where we're going from a mobile device standpoint. So really, it's all about the explosive growth of mobile devices in the enterprise, particularly around BYOD and the whole trend of people bringing in personal devices into the workplace. We'll talk about mobile OS risks, some of the emerging things we're seeing in terms of new types of malware and OS exploits for the various operating systems that are in the enterprise from an iOS and Android standpoint. And we'll talk a little bit about how the fragmented ecosystem of the mobile market in general kind of feeds into this and creates this potentially high-risk scenario for businesses. After that, we'll talk a bit about enterprises are seeing. We'll show some of our research data on the types of mobile security challenges specifically organizations are facing as they roll out mobility, and also give you some look at what organizations plan to spend on in the next 6 to 12 months, 18 months out in terms of mobile and security technologies. And my section with some conclusions and guidance based on the research. So first slide just gives you the idea of sort of where we've come from kind of since the dawn of, I guess you might say, the smartphone era, so 2007. Really seen an explosive growth in devices in the enterprise over that time period. Just BYOD alone, we've seen that grow 40% over the time period. Over 200 million devices deployed worldwide as we would categorize as BYOD. And it's really just been driven a lot by, I think, the consumer technology you see from Android to iOS, but also enterprise initiatives specifically around mobility. And it's not to say that corporate devices, corporate-owned devices haven't grown fast as well. We've seen 25% growth in those types of devices over that time period. But we're really at the point now where BYOD really vastly outnumbers corporate devices by almost 3 to 1. And BYOD in enterprises have many positive aspects. Our research shows that more productive, happier employees are the result of a lot of BYOD programs. There are proven cost savings that organizations have seen as a result of BYOD. But the devices can also bring risk. So as the installed base of individual liable or BYOD devices gets bigger in an organization, this essentially increases the potential attack surface of your enterprise, you might say. So you think about all the users in your organization bringing in tablets, phones they've gotten from the cell phone store or maybe even bought off eBay, secondhand devices. They're connecting these devices to corporate assets, email systems, shared, Dropbox type box applications that might be used, OneDrive, those types of things. They're plugging these things into corporate systems, and every time someone does that in your organization, they're really expanding the attack surface with the potential of exploiting the underlying OS of the device itself. This is some research we have on trends in enterprise mobility management, and this is really kind of the main, approach you might say that most organizations take from a mobile security standpoint. We're seeing pretty broad adoption of EMM and MDM across mid-sized and large organizations. The majority of enterprises in these categories either have EMM solutions now, or they're going to deploy them in the next 12 to 18 months. And for most organizations, their security strategy around mobile really begins in EMM. So they're sort of looking, and EMM has lots of functionality around device control, security, the ability to lock down certain applications and data usage. But it's not truly a threat detection technology. It's more of an enforcement tool to enforce certain types of settings and compliance of devices. It can take in feeds from other EMMs generally can take in information from other threat detection solutions, but they don't do the detection itself. So that's one of the issues around just an EMM-only deployment for mobile security. And the other issue around EMM is that it's not quite as pervasive as other traditional endpoint security solutions. So if you were to compare to, say, the penetration rate of antivirus on PCs in a corporate deployment, you'd have 80–90% of laptops covered with certain types of endpoint solutions. Whereas in most enterprises, less than half of the mobile endpoints used are actually enrolled in an EMM solution. So limited penetration, and also just limited from the perspective of what it can actually do from a threat detection standpoint. So as we said earlier, there's kind of a perception in the enterprise that mobile operating systems, there's an inherent security there. And to some extent, it's true. I mean, the new operating system models for iOS and Android have sandboxing and segmentation of data, and there's a lot of inherent safeguards that they've put in those platforms if you compare it to, say, like Win32 operating architectures of the past. So there's sort of an inherent assumption that security is better on these platforms, and then they're impervious to exploits and OS, faulty OS coding. But it's really not the case. And as you can see over the last few years, we've seen just a pretty high growth in the number of major device operating system vulnerabilities reported in the industry. Just recently, we've seen both iOS and Android spike in these areas. And these include both minor and major vulnerabilities to the operating systems. You've probably heard of things like Android, stage fright, Xcode Ghost, the Trident vulnerabilities for iOS. All of these code weaknesses can make devices running the software more susceptible to malware, which take advantage of weaknesses. And if you think about sort of where the trends are going from a device standpoint, if some other IDC data we have show pretty much consistent across the industry that PC shipments are declining. It's becoming, business computing is becoming less about the PC, really more about the mobile device. And so as you have more mobile devices coming in, attackers who are going to look for vulnerabilities in operating systems are really going to shift their focus to the mobile operating systems. Because at the end of the day, that's where the money is. That's where the data is. That's where the so-called crown jewels of an organization might be. And that's what generally the hackers are after, is this data and something valuable that they can get out of an exploit. So where there are vulnerabilities, there are exploits, and this is a timeline of just sampling some of the mobile-oriented malware that we've seen come on in the industry over the last couple of years. As you can see, similar to the vulnerabilities, there's a lot of different variants there's attacks on both types of operating systems. So Android, iOS, you pretty much see an equal number of malware manifestation around these areas. And as we talked about, the goal of most mobile malware is data theft. If you read through kind of the little descriptions of each of these, funky named viruses and malware, you see code is really designed to intercept messages, message content, skimming SMS traffic, application traffic. Some of the code is designed to steal credentials, go through phone contacts, really extract as much valuable information out of the mobile endpoint as possible. So again, it's a shift in focus and a shift in, I guess, even underlying philosophy of the malware creators, right? So looking to where the money is, as PCs become less of a core computing technology in the enterprise, more sensitive data moving to the endpoint, they're writing code basically to take advantage of this shift. And we're going to talk about Android specifically just a little bit on this slide because it's something that is a concern for a lot of the IT security teams that we talk to at IDC. And as you can see on the left here, Android, we talk about BYOD and sort of that massive growth in the enterprise, but Android in and of itself has also seen tremendous growth in the last few years. As you can see, over 200 million devices now just compared to 2011. And the majority of those Android devices are BYOD, and so probably for the most part, unmanaged devices. So there's a lot of risk in this scenario. So if you think about all the unmanaged Android that might be out there on your enterprise network connecting to systems, it's because a large number of these devices are running outdated or older versions of the operating system. So on the right here, we have data from Google that shows more than half of the deployed Android install base is running version 4.4 or earlier of the operating system. And that's where, if you look at, if you're to dig deep the exploits and vulnerabilities, that's where the majority of those exploits and vulnerabilities lives, in those older versions of the Android. Because for their part, both Apple and Google do keep up on the vulnerabilities, and they offer patches and upgrades to the operating system that take care of the security. But if you have a lag of adoption in the code in the new operating systems, that's the security gaps. So talking to enterprises, which we do a lot, and doing all the survey data that we do, we found from our most recent survey, about 31% of organizations told us that they experienced security issues as a result of their mobile application deployment. So of those, about 45% had challenges around regulatory issues and compliance. So these are organizations in the medical field, financial, government, retail, who have to comply with HIPAA, PCI, all the various data protection regulations that they have to conform to, and getting a mobile architecture to fit into those compliance rules, which are really written around traditional, LAN PC client type scenarios, is difficult. So that's a major challenge that we're seeing. After that, two of the bigger challenges are unauthorized access to sensitive data, and also lost or stolen data. So really the two of the three biggest challenges that the enterprises are facing around unauthorized access and stolen data really sync up with really the goal of the malware creators, which is to steal data from devices in and of itself. So if you think about sort of the number 2 or 3 goals after that, I mean, it's also around certain types of variants on these themes, like access control of VPN, security of data to third parties like a contractor or partner. They all roll into kind of that issue of data security, data control, and there is really kind of, I think, a beginning of a realization that sensitive data is starting to move to mobile devices, and there really aren't the safeguards there that there always have been to protect it. So we talked about the specific security challenges that enterprises are seeing. If you look at just the top challenges in general, beyond security, security is actually the #1 issue most organizations say they face when doing a mobility initiative or rollout. It trumps overruns of cost, lack of resources, any other type of challenge you might see, security comes out on top. And so security is really affecting the spending plans of a lot of enterprises on mobility. On the right, you see the top 3 mobility spending priorities of enterprises we surveyed. First of all, mobile devices. They want to get more devices in the field, more workers with devices. So, sort of expanding a mobility initiative, starts with devices. But after that, it's application security and content security are the two of the three biggest initiatives they have. So this really ties into kind of the whole, emerging, role of the mobile device as something that has a lot of very valuable data on it, connected to very sensitive backend systems. So, and you think about the technologies that fall into these categories: application security, content security. They're pretty broad. They can include anything from EMM, which we talked about earlier, to mobile threat detection, mitigation technologies for mobile data, mobile encryption. So a lot of different technologies fall in these areas, but the general themes are secure the apps, secure the data, and look for threats. Okay. So this slide shows some of our forecast data for the mobile-specific security markets, as well as the general security markets in general. And based on kind of the trend we talked about in the last slide, IDC is forecasting pretty strong growth in the mobile, and specifically the mobile security market and mobile security spending over the next 5 years or so. So if you look on the left here, compared to traditional security products, security technology categories like vulnerability management, threat management, identity, the mobile-specific technologies in these areas are going to actually go at a much higher rate, almost double in some cases, as the traditional technologies. And if you look on the right here, just the overall market, there was about $1.5 billion was spent on mobile security last year worldwide. That'll be over $3 billion by 2020. So the real takeaway from this is that although mobile security is somewhat of a nascent idea in some enterprises, there is spending happening on it today, and it's really going to ramp up in the next 3 to 5 years. So some things to think about and consider, as we kind of shift from traditional mindset of security to mobile. There's also going to have to be a shift, not just in the technologies that are bought, but also how they're deployed. And this will have to be done to accommodate sort of the new mobile workforce and the way it's distributed. So up until now, I think most deployments of security technologies in the enterprise were really infrastructure-centric, right? I mean, sensor-based technologies that focused on network infrastructure. This can include things like IPS, IDS, advanced persistent threat detection, firewalls, monitoring tools, a lot of monitoring, a lot of sensors, all deployed, in the infrastructure itself. So either on the network or in the host systems, really looking for types of threats, kind of a perimeter-based approach to security. What I think most enterprises are really missing, kind of with the new way of mobile computing in the enterprise, is the devices themselves. There's a big blind spot into the actual threats and what the devices themselves are seeing. So there'll have to be a shift to kind of from left to right over the next several years as organizations, kind of realize that threats are real on the endpoints and that there really isn't much technology or tools in place to monitor or watch for them. And this is another thing to consider, just if you think about sort of where we've come from in the industry to where we're going. If you think about how traditional PCs were bought and deployed in the enterprise, and the huge security aftermarket that existed to support that, you really don't have that today from a mobile perspective. I mean, if you think about deploying the latest Win 10 or Win 7, or we'll go back however many years to XP, when an organization deployed large-scale endpoint computing, there was always a very regimented and process to secure and lock down those machines. You wouldn't just take the machines from the OEM manufacturer and send them out into the wild. Obviously, it goes beyond security in terms of how you configure a device enterprise, but the layering of security solutions and technologies on top of the endpoints it got bigger and bigger. To some extent, it hampered the experience. I mean, you had bloat for certain applications and certain types of agents, but you had everything from antivirus to intrusion prevention, whitelisting, data protection. All of that had to be added to the point. You really don't have that scenario with mobile. and as we said earlier, the underlying architecture of mobile devices does supply or does provide a certain level of security and separation. So you don't have the types of, it's not as susceptible to the sort of rampant exploitation of malware that maybe Windows systems were in the past, just because of the nature of the OS. But if you think about how things were done in the past to how they're being done now, it's very different. And if you think about it from a security standpoint, you're probably not doing as much as you probably could be from a deployment standpoint of security technology. Like we said earlier, it's a bit of a blind spot if you're just rolling out devices into the organization and not putting some sort of additional security on top of them, particularly if you're supporting large BYO deployments where you really can't get a hold of the devices and you're just trusting that the operating systems are safe and up to date and not vulnerable to exploits. So this part kind of wraps up my section for conclusions and recommendations. What we talked about earlier, mobile threats, they're real and they're growing. Just in the last few years, we saw that the large growth of the actual vulnerabilities and the exploits coming online to take advantage of them. And really, it's not going to stop from a BYOD perspective. There's low-cost divide out there. The consumerization of IT that ship is pretty much sailed. So just being able to anticipate devices that are probably vulnerable, probably not as secure as you want them on your network is kind of the new normal. So it's really not a matter of if, but when a breach or some sort of incident occurs related to these devices. So I think overall, organizations need to get ahead of it. So as opposed to 10 years ago or more, when you had massive outbreaks of viruses, you had the Melissa, all these events that were really crippling organizations. That's when organizations really started to get serious about security. This time, don't wait for that to happen. Get ahead of this situation now with solutions that can actually protect from the things that are probably going to be coming down the line. So threat detection, vulnerability detection, that type of thing. And then as more devices come into the organization, we're going to be not just people using their own smartphones and tablets in the enterprise. They're going to be deployed as just standalone single-purpose devices too. So POS machines, kiosks. So as the footprint of devices grows in the organization, that's a good opportunity also to apply more lockdown technologies to those devices. So threat detection, OS vulnerability management, that type of thing. And then longer term, anticipate stricter regulatory requirements around mobile. So we talked about earlier the challenges organizations are already seeing around compliance with mobile. That's just going to get more complex. So depending on what industry in, PCI, HIPAA, those things will apply. If you're taking credit cards, if you're handling sensitive patient information, how you use those, how that data lives on mobile devices is going to be strictly regulated, and you have to anticipate that. And then GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation in the EU, that's coming down the line, and organizations even outside of Europe, if you're a U.S.-based multinational and you have offices in France or Germany, you're also susceptible to that regulation, which has very strict requirements around data privacy and security, and will require more mobile-focused technologies going forward. So with that, I will hand it over.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Phil. John. Really appreciate the transition there. Transitions nicely in terms of what you were talking about, where the traditional security practices amongst the PC isn't really going toward the mobile devices, and that mobile threats are real. So with that, I'll give it to John. He's going to take us through why are mobile threats real and how to detect these things.
Sure. Thanks, Scott. Especially Phil. It was a great point of view about the state of. I think we too, Phil, see that customers have I think a clear understanding of the threat in the desktop server endpoints, but they really don't have that sense of visibility and risk, and don't know how to calculate that risk on their mobile endpoints. And I think it was a great layout of the case right there. I'm actually borrowing an analogy from Scott here with kind of introducing to you how Zimperium approaches this problem of trying to help you get a sense of the visibility into the risk and into identifying threats in mobile devices. And so we'll go into that a little bit. I think that just even as not as a product pitch, in fact, you're not going to see any screens or any feature lists. You're going to see essentially the set of capabilities that we think you need as an organization in order to satisfy the risk that you're facing so that you can get on with life and not have the exposure. And that analogy I wanted to introduce, again, borrowing from Scott, is of the human body. If you think about it, the human body, if I'm walking down a block, I turn a corner and there's a lion standing right in front of me looking hungry, my body immediately reacts to that. It senses the risk and it reacts to that risk. It now knows that I am in a more vulnerable or risky condition. Or let's say I grab something hot or something cuts me that I've been using. Let's say I'm not quite the dexterous person that I wish I was, and I cut my own self. Our bodies have an inbuilt system in our nervous system that is constantly identifying the bacteria inside it or the outside threats or the conditions of the body that are suddenly a threat to our health, and immediately triggering reactions to that inside the body. Even in the risk, there was no physical attack from the lion yet, but just the notion of the risk increasing because of the presence of the lion, all of a sudden our bodies know to behave in a certain way and they react that way. Our mobile devices have no such mechanism. There is no kind of technology in a mobile device that essentially changes its activity when there's a threat, that identifies that threat even. If the mobile device is cut, in our analogy, by, let's say, malware being downloaded or you connecting to a malicious hotspot, there's nothing in that mobile device that senses for that and reacts to that. And that, in essence, is what Zimperium does. We are that sensor and that reaction. We are that assessment of vulnerability. In the analogy to the lion, we are the assessment of that vulnerability that allows your mobile devices to identify their risk, to react to the threats in a real-time, immediate basis, and of course, something the human body can't do, except maybe when I scream. When I see the lion, I'm going to scream. Of course, in the mobile world, there needs to be a mechanism to get the awareness of that risk and of that threat into a cloud-based system so that we can identify that threat remotely. So that's essentially what Zimperium is and does. And there are lots of ways we could go through this analogy, but let me give you another one. Here's a Waze screenshot of New York. And I, for one, would never try to get around New York without some kind of mapping software, some kind of navigation software, identifying for me the proper route, and especially identifying the areas of concern where I need to be careful. Where are there issues with my ability to get from point A to point B? Now, in a mobile world, this is what your map looks like of New York. You have no visibility into the threats that are occurring. You have no awareness. You could have hundreds, thousands of devices of your employees, your partners, your constituents, or even the users of your application, if you're an app developer, deployed all over here in this area of New York, and you wouldn't have any visibility, most of you at least, would have no visibility into the notion of the risk or threats associated there. But in fact, we at Zimperium have a significant sense of what that is because we have those sensors on devices and we have the visibility into the risk and threats that are being delivered to devices. So we have that visibility. And of course, we think that you need this visibility just the same way you do in the desktop and the server world. So that's essentially what Zimperium can deliver and how that works. And so let's drill down one level. Phil made the statement, the accurate statement, the risk is real, the vulnerabilities are real, the threat is already real, and it's increasing. Let's take a look at risk first, and we'll deal with threats in a second. What is the risk perspective of a typical customer that we work with? Here is a breakdown of that. So if you look at the two green areas, these are devices the company considers safe enough for them to entitle with email, SharePoint, or whatever it is that the company provides. It would be risky, too risky, to provide that to the left-hand side colors, those orange and red colors, because they are configured, either they have no malware on them, they're jailbroken, they allow for third-party download, etc. There is some condition about these devices that the companies decided by policy, this is too risky a device for us to entitle. OS vulnerability is one, in fact, that Phil mentioned, and I think is quite accurate. When you have known high severity vulnerabilities in the mobile platform, the OS, and you are not patching fast enough, that dramatically increases your risk. An important facet of this, the two green colors, there's an important distinction here. When we first deployed to this customer, every device represented by this graph had access to the enterprise systems because, as we said, they had no visibility of the risk of vulnerability. They couldn't make this distinction until our software deployed to the devices. Once it did, they had the ability to remove the entitlement to the devices that were too risky. That makes sense, right? They removed the entitlement to all of the devices except the dark green ones. That, of course, caused human behavior to change in many cases, and that's why there's a whole big slice of this pie or of this chart that says vulnerability mitigated. What that means is the user community of this particular company said, all right, I lost my access to the company systems because I haven't topped up my firmware, or I have this insecure configuration. I will go ahead and change that, and then I'll get my entitlements back. That large light green slice lost entitlement because we thought it was too risky, and they got it back once they mitigated those risks. This is essentially what a security team is designed to do. It cannot stop every threat from ever occurring, right? That's not reasonable. But it is supposed to have an accurate assessment of the risk of threat, which is what this gives, and provide proactive means to reduce that risk over time, which again is what this does. So we're really proud of our ability to help you identify in your mobile fleet the sense of risk, right? Wait, there's a lion there, and be able to do something about it. Take some kind of action so that you can mitigate risks before you're attacked. But let's talk specifically about threats, because it's very frequent, and I'm sure Phil, in Phil's comments, you heard the same thing. We often start with a customer by saying, mobile devices are vulnerable just like any other computing device. And in fact, it's happening. And we often get some pushback on this notion. Are you sure? Are there really threats being delivered to mobile devices? Well, unfortunately, just think of the opportunity. Hackers go where the opportunity is. It's just a reality that we use our mobile devices now often more than we use our desktop devices. If you wanted to attack me personally, getting to my desktop device at my office or at my house, you probably get 10% of my activity there. You're going to get 90% of my activity on my mobile device, on my iPad, on my iPhone. So those are devices that are now more a target we see than even desktops. And so, yes, real threats are being delivered to those devices. And here's a breakdown. Again, one particular company, and this is only over a 4-month period, by the way, for this particular company. So there was a, relatively speaking, I think, small number, maybe it's 20% of the devices that had no threat of any severity seen. And to be totally fair, this TCP scan threat that you see on the left-hand side, this light orange color, is not necessarily a significant threat. It could indicate surveillance, which is important, right? We need to know if someone is trying to interrogate the devices in order to identify either what type of device it is to deliver an exploit to it, or identify who the device owner is so that they could craft a social engineering campaign, et cetera, et cetera. So there are reasons why TCP scans are potential threats. They're not necessarily high-risk threats. But if you look at some of these red and some of these orange, they are clearly significant threats. The majority of those, and I won't read them all to you, but let me just summarize. The vast majority of them are network threats in nature. If you think about a mobile device in 3 ways, the device itself, that's exploiting the device, the networks that it attaches to, cell and data networks, and then of course the apps that run on the device, the network threat vectors are about 70% of the threats that we see. And what does that look like? Malicious Wi-Fis, man-in-the-middle attacks on safe, supposedly or presumably safe Wi-Fis. Like you're in the coffee shop and you're sitting getting access, you're getting free data off your data, you're not paying for data because you're on the coffee shop's Wi-Fi, but so is a hacker who is now decrypting your SSL traffic, inserting an SSL certificate onto your device, reading all your data, and installing their own software onto your mobile device. That's all possible through network threats. 70% of the threats we see are network in nature. And they sometimes escalate to device level threats, because once I have access to your device to deliver a malicious payload, I can do that without you even knowing. So in fact, Phil mentioned the Trident vulnerabilities. Those were one of the first times we saw a significant reaction from the iOS community realizing that there's vulnerability in iOS. There is vulnerability in iOS. It's just less frequently documented than it is in Android. It's there, it's just less frequently documented. And in this case, it was. It just so happens that those vulnerabilities were discovered when an activist was given a link in an SMS and said, hey, click on this link. And he did not. He instead sent it to a researcher. It would have been just as easy for that hack to be delivered via a network threat, and the user would never have to have clicked on anything. So there are real threats. They are definitely being delivered. Here is a breakdown of a real company. This happens to be a West Coast-based technology company, by the way, and over the course of only 4 months. So the threat is in fact real. So we propose that there are 4 dimensions, if you will, to protecting your mobile devices. And this is a summary of something that both Phil and I have already said, so I can move fairly quickly through this. You've got to have an assessment of your vulnerability and risk. You have to have a point of view about the risk before you can actually then identify where you're most vulnerable, what steps you should take, etc. Until you understand that, it's very difficult to act. And then the 3 facets of the mobile device to protect are the device itself from exploitation like a stage fright or a Trident Pegasus, network attacks, the ones I just described on the previous slide, really good examples, SSL decryption, SSL certificates, captive portals, all man in the middle, all of those different things. And then, of course, apps themselves can be a threat. Apps themselves are, in fact, literal malware is on approximately 1% of the devices in just about every case that we initially install our software to. And then, of course, we identify it immediately and pull it off, and we remediate those threats. And then if any malware apps do land on the devices after we're already there, we immediately identify them before they're able to detonate, and we pull them off. But apps are actually a threat not only from a malware perspective, which is very binary, right? The app is intending to harm you. There are other apps that aren't intentionally harming you, but are abusing their permissions. They have capabilities that you wish they didn't have, and they're able to use those capabilities in ways you don't want them to. Or they themselves create vulnerabilities in the device. They essentially open back doors for hackers where you can actually, instead of trying to exploit the device's OS, you can exploit an app that's running on your device and get permissions and get equal access in some cases for what the hacker is looking to try to do. So apps provide you with actually 3 threats themselves: malware, privacy, and security to essentially to open new vulnerabilities to you. So these 4 areas, having a vulnerability assessment, being able to protect the device, the network, and the apps themselves, those 4 things taken together represent what we think mobile threat protection needs to be. We integrate this frequently with the enterprise mobile management solutions that Phil had mentioned, and frequently not. There are 2 ways that we can deploy. In either case, we think it's important to note there's a significant difference in the approach to securing mobility than there is to securing the traditional corporate desktop. If you think about it, you and I have no expectation of privacy when we're sitting at our company's desktop. We know there's an email filter reading our emails. We know that there's a web proxy that's reading every web page and looking at every URL we go to. And if we go to a URL that is considered by the company not appropriate, we don't get that website. We get a block, right? That makes sense. We all understand the companies need to protect itself. And while we're on the company's network, on the company's equipment, we're going to get that surveillance. But our mobile devices are a different story, aren't they? These are hybrid use devices. These, even company owned, are typically hybrid use devices where I do personal business and have personal interests and personal information on these devices as well as corporate. And especially if I'm using my own device and I happen to give the company the ability to run its apps on it, or I have company data on my personal device, then it's a different story, isn't it? The notion that most security products have, even some in mobile, is security via surveillance. The desktop examples I gave you are examples of security via surveillance. They surveil the device and your activity, and they identify security issues through their surveillance, and they, of course, go about their business if they identify something, if they trigger something. Mobile devices that we submit is not an appropriate approach. The personal use side of these devices is such that there is a privacy concern that is not only an issue from we think a corporate responsibility standpoint, but it's frankly a legal issue in regions of the world where you need an approach to securing these mobile devices that is purely on device. And again, I'll borrow something Phil had mentioned, the ability to detect on device, identify, essentially, he described it as shifting right, be able to take your detection all the way to the device is an important aspect in mobility. We think it's super critical because in order to identify device threats and risk without exposing privacy concerns, you have to do it on device. So our approach, which we submit as the best approach, is to do detection on device. So we would consider that important and want you to think about that, consider that when you think about securing your mobile initiatives. And then one last comment I'd like to make. There are two different facets even to securing mobility. I think this entire conversation, Phil and I have spent probably with you in the mode of thinking about corporate owned or bring your own devices attaching to the company's network and running, getting access to email, let's say. And that's absolutely true. And you've got to secure those things, no doubt about it. But most of you work for a company that also produces apps for your customers or your partners or even your own people. Those apps, think about it, those apps have an entire facet of security issues and risk of fraud or abuse or threat, or threats could come into the company through those apps by weaponizing those apps that are equal, or in the case of some of you, the app install base is so much larger than your employee base, maybe the surface area of that attack is actually greater than the surface area of your own BYO or corporate owned devices. So apps you produce need to be secured as well. And this gets tough, guys, because there is no EMM to manage your entitlement. You're putting that app in an app store, and anybody on any old firmware running a really old iOS, let's say, connected to known bad networks, running known malware, jailbroken the device on purpose, is now running your app, which makes you more vulnerable as the app producer to weaponizing, to fraud, to all kinds of things, right? So what do we do there? You take the same on-device detection technology that we've all mentally been putting in an app and running on these corporate-owned devices. You take the same detection technology and you put it into your app. So let's go all the way back to my first slide. That human body has in it this sense of identifying risk and reaction to threats, right? That in our world as Imperium is called Z9. Z9 is both packaged as an app that you can deploy onto devices. It's also an SDK you can deploy into your own apps. Either way, you get the visibility into threats, you get the ability to react to those threats, to take steps to protect yourself. So we again think these last three slides that I've presented essentially are our case for what the world-class mobile threat protection needs to look like. It's got to cover your apps and your mobile devices. It's got to be able to do so without a surveillance model, and it has to be able to cover all four of those aspects: risk, device, network, and apps. So here are just a few questions to wrap up my section, and then I'll hand it over to Scott, who's going to get to your questions. But I would ask these questions internally if I were you guys. Have we adopted a position concerning the acceptable risk posture of mobile devices, and can we enforce it? Think about it. If you don't even know your risk posture, why are you entitling these devices with all kinds of goodies, right? Do we know if threats are being perpetrated on our employees' mobile devices today? For most of you, the answer is, I assume not. For some of you, the answer is, I assume so, but the fact that you use the word assume means we've got a problem, right? Because it means you don't actually know. And then third, have we performed an assessment of all the potential risks associated with our mobile apps? Very often, I've been in large audiences. I've said, by show of hands, people, these are all CISOs or CISO -1 type people. And I would say, by show of hands, raise your hand if you're working with an app development team and their app. Almost no hands ever go up. The people building the apps frequently don't have the security background, or they don't have the necessary instincts to think about securing these apps. That's how vulnerabilities are created to begin with. And so we've got to get that linkage between the mobile app development teams and the teams that are responsible for security. So that would be, I think, an important first step, is getting an assessment of the potential risks. So there's a few questions you might take home with you. Now let's move from here to Q&A, and I'll hand it back to Scott.
Hey, thanks, John. Really appreciate that. And please, everyone, take those 3 questions back to your office and really just get an understanding of what's going on and what type of risk that you may have. And we'll help you measure it. So let me go through the questions here and see what we've got. Will this presentation deck be made available? We will provide the recording of this session. But we will not distribute the slides, but you can come back and watch the video. So here's an interesting one, and I'm assuming this is for you, John. Are you proposing patches to be deployed outside of the normal patch deployment of the device vendor or cellular provider? Maybe both you and Phil, it sounds like an Android question.
Sure, I can start, and then Phil, you can clean up that for us. We don't think so. As Imperium, when I say we, deploying patches to the mobile OSs outside of the normal update process might create a configuration nightmare for you guys. And you may not have enough control over those devices to even be able to do it. So I'm not suggesting that that's the right approach. And to be totally candid, I'll try not to get on a soapbox because my time for that was a few minutes back. But you got to top off the firmware. It's clear you got to be on the most current version you can be on. But even with that, that just solves for the known vulnerabilities. It doesn't solve for the unknown vulnerabilities. So, Trident was available to hackers for years before it was ever disclosed. And in every likelihood used. In fact, we know. In fact, I think the NSO group had mentioned that it was on the market for years and it was sold to many organizations. So those hacks are not new. They are old. They are just recently discovered. So patching is clearly necessary, but it is clearly not sufficient. So I would not get overly crazy about patching. I'd just make sure that you're doing it frequently. And I would work on detecting the unknown, which is what a solution like ours can do, right? That's what the nervous system is about. Phil?
Yeah, patching is it's a touchy subject depending on the organization you're talking to. Yeah, I would definitely agree that obviously being on the latest operating system version is critical because like we've said, Apple are working on these things. They have people on it, so getting the latest software from them is going to be very important. At the same time, I've actually talked to organizations that have not wanted to do that. They've said that, hey, every time I update my operating system, I have to rewrite my app. I have this specific corporate app that does a certain type of thing. A lot of times these might be people and just, ruggedized applications on certain types of devices. They're used to things being the same for a very long period of time. And, it kind of runs counter to, I think, to a lot of the security, sort of overarching security edicts that you hear out there. But it depends on who the organization is and what they're trying to do. Generally speaking, though, yeah, you want to be on the most updated patches. But to that point of an organization that maybe want to avoid that type of thing or have more consistent sort of footprint on the devices, that makes a security technology even more important because you're going to need something on that device to look for anomalies, to look for things outside of the normal behavior of the endpoint, particularly if it's, like I said, in those organizations that are maybe using it for single purpose or ruggedized. If the only thing that app does is scan a barcode and send it up to a server, if the device is doing anything but that, what's going to be there to tell some system that this is happening and to mitigate that? So it's a broad issue, I think. Obviously, yes, generally being up on for most organizations, it's being up on the latest operating system is critical, though.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Phil. I got one more question for you, and then I've got one last one from Jacob to John. So on the last couple of your slides, Phil, where you talked about like shifting right, and you went from the PC, those software, the antivirus, and these guys are already trained in incident response, right? And you move into mobile. Who is most often, through your research, the champion of mobile threat detection? So we've got EMM guys, they got the mobility teams and the app dev, and we have the security teams. Who is the logical champion for something like this?
I think for the most part, for the organizations we've talked to, it's the owner of the EMM platform. They're kind of the gatekeeper for technologies to get on the phones. And traditionally, in most organizations, we've seen that sort of originate to some extent from the groups within IT that sort of manage either telecom or mobile devices or mobile app platforms like email. So the email administrator might have evolved into the person who runs the BES, the BlackBerry server, who then became the person who handled all the mobile devices, and now they're running the EM. So you see that sort of common sort of evolution of that role. I think that is changing in organizations now that mobile is becoming such a, you hear the mantra mobile first in a lot of discussions now. And that's really driving, I think, visibility of mobility just beyond that sort of smaller enclave of IT folks. So you get more CISOs involved in deciding what these platforms are going to plug into, what's going to be watching the mobile devices, all the way up to the CIO level. You're starting to hear more organizations sort of put into place sort of a mobility center of excellence, and a lot of times that'll include a security aspect of it too. So depending on how mobile centric the organization is, it'll vary, but in general we've kind of seen that progression from the phone person, the email person, the MDM EMM person, and then as it gets more pervasive and especially if there's ever an incident, then it boils up and floats up to kind of higher level of IT decision makers.
Okay, John, last question. Mm-hmm. What are some issues that you have found or we have found when implementing a solution in an org? So kind of touch on Phil, kind of says that our EMM guys are the gatekeepers because they run the devices. Sure. What are some of the issues?
Yeah, so it's a great question because anytime you go tell somebody, as a company, I want to run this app on your phone, even if it's a corporate-owned phone, they still feel that sense of possession, right? And so you go through a careful adoption process, and the software has to make absolutely sure that it does nothing to the user experience that anyone would consider negative. And unlike EMM, by the way, which is a all upside for the company, practically no upside for the employee issue, a threat protection solution protects the user as well, right? We're not just protecting the corporate data, we're protecting your personal data. We're not just protecting the company's, we'll say, exposure that your mobile device use is. It's also yours individually. So there's actually a win-win here where the company gets protected and you personally get protected on your mobile device. So adoption issues are normally very low, but you do have to be sensitive to the fact that you're asking your employees to run an app on their devices. So you go through typically our customers, and by the way, we're on, at one customer, we're on 40,000 devices, and we have many, many customers. So this is a solved problem, but there's a simple process for it. It essentially is you pilot it with 100 or so people, where no one freaks out. No one says I can't use my phone anymore. Everyone says, oh, I even forgot it's running. And then on that basis, you roll it out in a large scale deployment, and everything's just fine. So it's actually pretty easy and pain free. But you are sensitive to the issues. You have to do that. Now, remember, we also want to protect your apps as well. There, the adoption's even simpler because it's just a development team third-party library in that case. Your development team already pulls in dozens of third-party libraries. This is just one more of those third-party libraries to pull in. It's very easy to integrate it into their code base. It's such a small number of lines of code that they'd be surprised how simple it is. And and so the adoption in the app side is actually even lower, or I should say adoption issues are even lower. And that's one of the reasons we love the app approach so much. If your company produces an app that everyone in the company uses, you might actually solve for both sides of your problem just through the SDK approach. But regardless, that's something that you'd engage with us and we'd talk about which are the best routes to go.
Well, thanks, John, and thanks, Phil, and thanks for everybody staying on. We have most of the people still listening to Q&A, so I really appreciate that. We will provide this recording in a day or two and put that on YouTube. You can come back and take a look. And also go to zimperium.com. There is an IDC Innovator Report that Phil has authored. You're free to have that and any other resources we have on the site. So again, thanks, everyone.